The rich CEO thought he was just making his routine check-in at a restaurant he owned. But little did he know, that visit would turn his world upside down. A nervous waitress, barely able to keep her hands from trembling, slid a folded note across his table. He opened it with casual curiosity, not expecting the words inside to change everything. What he read in that moment would not only stun him into silence but would ignite a chain of events that would bring down his entire empire. What happened next would unravel a deep, dark conspiracy and shake his world to the core, threatening to expose secrets he'd gone to great lengths to bury. Before we dive in, don't forget to like the video, hit that subscribe button, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now let's continue. The CEO, Victor Matthews, sat confidently at the corner table of his restaurant, pretending to be just another customer. He was a man used to getting what he wanted. Every deal, every meal, every moment of his life seemed to unfold exactly as he commanded. His success in the business world was well known, and his restaurant stretched across continents. At 45, Victor had everything money could buy. A penthouse in New York, a luxury yacht, and a reputation built on ruthless business practices. But today something felt different. He wasn't here to oversee the launch of a new franchise or meet with investors. Today he was here to check on the small diner that had recently been acquired by his empire, a business venture that was already starting to show signs of failure. The staff seemed inattentive, the decor worn down, and the energy of the place felt stagnant. It wasn't the kind of place he usually frequented. And as he watched the waitress approach him with a barely noticeable tremor in her hands, he felt a flicker of irritation. She set down his coffee without meeting his eyes. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nervousness he could clearly see in her demeanor. Victor gave a cold smile. "Aren't you supposed to be a little more enthusiastic?" he said with a mocking tone. "Don't you know who I am?" Her eyes briefly flickered toward him, but she didn't speak, merely nodding as she moved to clear a nearby table. Victor could feel his irritation growing. He was used to being treated with respect, not with the indifference he was receiving today. This wasn't the way he expected his employees to behave, especially not the ones who worked in one of his restaurants. He took a sip of his coffee, the bitter taste leaving a sour note on his tongue. He was about to make another cutting remark when he noticed something. The waitress had left a small folded piece of paper beside his cup. It was carefully placed, almost deliberately. He hesitated for a moment before reaching out and unfolding it. His eyes quickly scanned the message. "They're stealing from you. Meet me at 8 p.m. tonight near the fountain at Millennium Park. Come alone." The words hit him like a slap across the face. His heart skipped a beat as a cold chill ran down his spine. This wasn't some typical complaint or request. It was a warning. The kind of warning that could ruin everything he had built. His fingers trembled slightly as he folded the paper back and slipped it into his wallet. What the hell was this? Who was this waitress and why was she sending him a note like this? Victor tried to regain his composure, but the unease inside him only deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The diner, the employees, the atmosphere, it all felt like a front for something darker, something more dangerous. Minutes later, as he watched the waitress move through the dining room, he realized he was no longer looking at her just as an employee. He was looking at someone who knew something, someone who had information he needed, even if he didn't know how she came by it. And when she finally came to his table again, he was ready. "Excuse me," Victor said, his voice low and controlled. "I believe you've left something for me." Her gaze shifted toward him, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. It was as if she had known this moment was coming. "Yes, sir," she replied, though her voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. Victor leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "I think you and I need to have a conversation. You seem to know something that I don't, and I'm very interested to hear it." She didn't flinch. Instead, she held his gaze, her expression calm but determined. For a second he thought she might turn and walk away, but she didn't. She simply nodded as if everything was falling into place. "I'm not going to say anything here," she whispered, leaning closer. "But I'll tell you everything tonight. Just meet me at the fountain in Millennium Park at 8 o'clock. Don't bring anyone." The waitress turned and walked away, leaving Victor staring after her. His thoughts were racing. What was she involved in? Who was behind this conspiracy? And what could she possibly know that would bring him to the brink of losing everything? Victor's heart raced as he watched the waitress approach him in the dim light of Millennium Park. The world seemed to slow down, every noise around him blending into the background as his mind tried to make sense of what was happening. She had asked him to meet her here alone. No backup. No bodyguards. Just her and him, on the cusp of something that felt like it was going to change everything. She walked slowly, deliberately, her eyes locked on him with an intensity that unsettled him. He had expected to feel more powerful, more in control, but right now, standing in the park, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. When she finally reached him, she stopped a few feet away, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city in the distance. He could see her clearly now, the same waitress who had given him that note earlier, the same woman who had slipped through his defenses without him even realizing it. But now something was different about her. She wasn't the nervous, apologetic woman he had seen earlier. She was composed, and for the first time he was unsure of what to expect. "Are you going to tell me what this is about?" he asked, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. The uncertainty gnawed at him. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around, making sure they were alone. The park was empty, save for a few distant figures scattered in the shadows. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "You have no idea what's been going on behind your back, do you?" Her words sent a chill down his spine. She wasn't just talking about some small mistake or misstep. She was talking about something bigger. Something that threatened everything he had built. Victor's jaw tightened. "I don't have time for riddles. Either you tell me what's going on, or I'm leaving." The waitress, Sophie, as he remembered, finally met his gaze. Her eyes were cold now, but there was something else in them. Something that made him take a cautious step back. "You think you built this empire on your own, don't you?" she said, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. "You think your hard work, your vision made it all happen. But you're wrong. You're just a puppet." Victor felt his blood run cold at her words. "What the hell are you talking about?" She took a deep breath, seeming to gather herself before continuing. "You're just a front. A front for a much bigger operation that you know nothing about. The money behind Blackwood Restaurants, the real money, doesn't come from your investors or your so-called genius. It comes from illegal deals, money laundering, and human trafficking." Victor's mind went blank. He could barely process the words coming from her mouth. He had always known there were things going on in the background that he couldn't control. But this was something far beyond his imagination. "You're lying," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. Sophie shook her head slowly, almost pityingly. "I wish I were. But you know deep down that I'm not. The signs have always been there if you bothered to look. But you never did you? You were too busy playing the part of the perfect CEO. You were too busy sitting at the top of your empire to notice the cracks forming beneath you." Victor's chest tightened. He had worked so hard to get here, to build his empire, and now, in a single moment, it was all being threatened by a woman who had once served him coffee in one of his restaurants. "You're wrong," he said again, but this time there was no conviction behind the words. His mind was racing, his thoughts colliding in a chaotic mess. Could it really be true? Could everything he had worked for be based on a lie? "I'm not wrong," Sophie replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm just the messenger. The people behind this operation, they've been using you for years. They've been funneling money through your restaurants, laundering it through legitimate means. And you've been too blinded by your own success to see it." Victor took a step forward, his breath coming faster now. "How do you know all this?" Sophie's gaze hardened. "Because I've seen it with my own eyes. I've worked for these people. I've seen the transactions, the accounts, the deliveries that don't make sense. I've watched as they've used their connections to cover up the crimes they're committing. And I've had enough." Victor's mind reeled. He had never imagined something like this could be happening. He had always been careful, always stayed within the lines. Or so he thought. But now, everything he had believed about his success felt like it was crumbling around him. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't understand why Sophie, this waitress, would be putting herself at risk by exposing all of this. It didn't add up. She looked away for a moment, her face shadowed by the street lights. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost regretful. "Because I'm tired of being a part of it. I want out. But I can't just walk away. If I do, they'll make sure I disappear. If I tell the authorities, they'll silence me. I need someone with power, someone who can bring this all down. You're that person, Victor." Victor's mind raced. This was a moment he couldn't let slip by. If what Sophie was saying was true, he had the power to take down one of the most dangerous criminal networks in the country. But what would it cost him? Would he be able to survive the consequences? Before he could ask another question, Sophie pulled out a small envelope from her jacket pocket and handed it to him. "This is the proof," she said quietly. "Everything you need to take them down. But you have to act fast. They'll be on to you soon." Victor took the envelope, his hands shaking as he turned it over. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him, could feel the enormity of the decision he was about to make. But before he could open the envelope, Sophie's phone rang. She glanced at it, her face paling. "We don't have much time," she said, urgency in her voice. "They know I'm here. They'll be coming for us." Victor's pulse quickened. What was he supposed to do? He had the power to take everything down, but at what cost? Suddenly, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned just in time to see a black car pulling up in the distance. Figures in dark suits stepped out, moving quickly toward them. Sophie grabbed his arm. "We need to go. Now." But before they could make a move, a voice called out from behind them. "Victor Matthews." Victor froze. He turned slowly, his eyes locking with the figure approaching them. It was Kevin Murphy, his district manager from the diner, the same man Sophie had warned him about. Victor's heart raced as he locked eyes with Kevin Murphy, his district manager, who had emerged from the darkness like a shadow. The air around them seemed to thicken, and Victor's mind spun with the realization that everything Sophie had said was true. Kevin wasn't just a manager, he was part of something much bigger, something dangerous. "What are you doing here?" Victor's voice was low, barely a whisper. He could feel the weight of the envelope in his pocket, the evidence that could tear apart the criminal empire that had been lurking beneath his business. But now, as Kevin moved closer, he couldn't help but wonder how much of a risk this truly was. How much danger had he just walked into? Kevin's cold blue eyes never left his. "You should have stayed in your little world, Victor. You had everything you needed. You had the money, the power, the status. But you got greedy. You started digging into things you didn't understand." Victor stood still, his pulse hammering in his chest. He was trying to piece it together, trying to make sense of what Kevin was saying. Sophie's warning echoed in his mind, "They'll be coming for us." The figures behind Kevin, dressed in black suits, began to move closer. Victor felt trapped. Sophie's hand tightened around his arm. "We need to go. Now," she said urgently. But it was too late. Kevin's men had already surrounded them, cutting off any chance of escape. Victor was left with no choice but to face Kevin, his thoughts racing. Was Sophie telling the truth? Had he really been so blind, so naive, that he hadn't seen the web of corruption surrounding him? Kevin stepped forward, his smile nothing more than a thin, dangerous line. "You've been asking questions, Victor. You've been looking into things that don't concern you. But you need to understand there's a price to pay for this kind of curiosity." "What do you want?" Victor asked, his voice trembling with anger and fear. "What are you really doing?" Kevin's eyes narrowed and he leaned in, his voice a deadly whisper. "We've been in this business long before you. You thought you were in control, but you were just a pawn. You were never supposed to know about the laundering, the trafficking, the deals in the shadows. But you pushed too far. And now, I'm afraid you're going to have to pay the price." Victor's stomach churned. He had suspected for months that something wasn't right, but this was worse than he could have ever imagined. His empire wasn't built on success, it was built on lies and darkness. And now, as the realization hit him, he felt a cold sweat form on his brow. He had been the one deceived. "I've never been a part of that," Victor said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You're lying. You're all lying." Kevin didn't flinch. "You can tell yourself that if it makes you feel better. But deep down you know the truth. You've been blind to it for too long, but you're starting to see it now, aren't you? You're not the CEO you think you are. You're just a figurehead for something much worse." Victor stood there, paralyzed as Kevin's men continued to move around him, closing in on all sides. Sophie, however, seemed unbothered. Her expression remained cool and collected, though Victor could see the fear in her eyes. But she wasn't afraid to confront Kevin. She had been through this before. And somehow she was ready. "Victor," Sophie said, her voice firm, "this isn't about business anymore. This is about survival. You don't get to walk away from this. Not after everything you've seen." Victor glanced at her, trying to understand what she meant. Was she trying to help him? Or had she known all along that this was how it would end? Sophie's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something in her gaze, not fear but resolve. She wasn't scared of Kevin or the men with him. She had a plan. And somehow it involved him. Kevin smirked, clearly enjoying the tension in the air. You've been misled, Victor. But it's too late now. Sophie's right, you're in this whether you like it or not. I'm not going anywhere, Victor said, his voice gaining strength. His anger rose, fueled by a sense of betrayal and frustration. What do you want from me? Kevin stepped forward, his grin widening. What I want, Victor, is for you to finally realize that you're not the one in charge. You never were. The men behind Kevin moved closer, closing in on Sophie and Victor. Kevin's men grabbed Sophie's arms, pulling her away from Victor, but she didn't resist. Her eyes never left Kevin's face. This is your last chance, Kevin said, his tone dropping to a deadly whisper. Give us the evidence or we'll make sure no one ever hears about this again. Victor's eyes flicked to Sophie, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. She was telling him something without words and he understood. She had the power to bring everything down, if he was willing to trust her. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope, his hands trembling. He didn't know what would happen next, but this was it. This was the moment he would either lose everything or take back control. He handed the envelope to Kevin, who took it with a satisfied smile. Good choice, Kevin said, his voice dripping with triumph. Now we can all go back to our lives. Victor stepped back, his heart pounding. He had done it. He had given them the evidence. But something in the back of his mind didn't feel right. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a huge mistake. And then Sophie's voice broke through the tension. You think it's over, don't you? Kevin looked at her, his face twisted with amusement. What do you mean? Sophie stepped forward, her eyes locked on Victor. You're not going to get away with this. You've made your move, but you haven't seen what's coming next. Victor's heart skipped a beat. What was she talking about? Before he could ask, Sophie reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device. She pressed a button and suddenly the screen on her phone lit up with a live feed of Kevin's office. A hidden camera in his office had been recording their every move. Victor's jaw dropped. You've been under surveillance, Kevin, Sophie said coldly. And you're about to learn that no matter how deep you think you've buried your secrets, they always come back to the surface. Kevin's face went white. You wouldn't? I already did, Sophie interrupted. The tension in the room was palpable as the agents continued to survey the footage from the security cameras. Victor sat in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table in front of him. Every second that ticked by felt like a lifetime. Sophie's face, framed by the harsh fluorescent lights, was the only thing that remained in focus for him. She was just out of reach, still holding the evidence that could end this nightmare for them both. Victor shifted, his mind racing. The knowledge that everything he had built, the empire, the wealth, the power, could come crumbling down in an instant was suffocating. His fingers tightened around the table, the metal of the cuffs digging into his skin. He knew Sophie's drive contained everything they needed to expose the conspiracy. But would it be enough? Outside the room, Agent Park was speaking to her superior. The words were too muffled for Victor to hear, but he could tell the conversation was heated. Park's position had been clear. The conspiracy had grown beyond them all. And yet, even though the evidence was irrefutable, Victor had this gnawing feeling that they weren't done yet. Whoever was pulling the strings behind the scenes, they weren't finished. Victor Matthews, Agent Park's voice broke through his thoughts, her sharp tone making him look up. You've built an empire, haven't you? He nodded slowly, swallowing the bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't built on lies, if that's what you're implying. Park's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer. Isn't it? How do you explain the missing funds, the falsified accounts, the shell companies? She tossed a folder onto the table, each page a strike against him. Do you expect us to believe that you had no idea? Victor's pulse quickened. The pieces were falling into place. Everything that he'd worked for was about to be shattered. I didn't build this empire alone, he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. There were people who helped me along the way. People who took advantage of me. The words hung in the air. Park's gaze softened for a moment, but only briefly. You're trying to blame others now? You've been at the top for how long? And now you're saying you're the victim? Sophie's face flashed in his mind, her quiet determination, the way she'd looked at him when she handed him that folder. She had known, even before he had, that everything was connected. She was the key to bringing it all down. I wasn't always in charge, Victor muttered, his thoughts racing back to the early days. I didn't know what I was getting into. There were bigger players, people with more power than me. Agent Park stopped pacing. You're playing a dangerous game, Victor. You don't know who you're up against. Her voice had lost its sharpness, replaced with a quiet intensity. But you're right about one thing. You weren't alone in this. Victor's head snapped up, his heart hammering. What are you talking about? A small smirk tugged at Park's lips. You really thought you were running the show? You've been a puppet for years, Victor. And now, everyone you've ever trusted is watching you crash and burn. Every deal, every trade, every favor, it all ties back to them. Victor felt the blood drain from his face. Who? He demanded, standing up despite the cuffs. Who is it? Park's gaze darkened. She didn't say a word, but the look on her face told him everything he needed to know. The people who had been behind the scenes all along, pulling strings, creating this web of corruption. It wasn't just a few disgruntled employees. It was much bigger than that. The door to the interrogation room opened. Sophie stepped inside, her face grim but resolute. She held the drive that had started it all, the piece of evidence that could end this once and for all. But when she met his eyes, Victor saw the uncertainty there. She had already known more than he could ever guess, but now it was clear. She was not just playing a part in this. She was the wild card that could change everything. Sophie glanced at Park, then back at Victor. There's something you need to know. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He stood up straighter, trying to read her, trying to prepare himself for whatever revelation was coming. What is it? Sophie hesitated before she spoke, her voice low. You've been set up. Victor's mind spun. What do you mean? The drive I gave you, Sophie continued, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. It's not just evidence of the conspiracy. It's evidence of something else. She handed him a printout, a single page that shook him to his core. It was a list of names. Familiar names. People he had worked with, trusted. People who had been with him from the very beginning. But at the bottom of the list was a name that stopped his breath. Adrian Blackwood. Victor recoiled. No. This can't be right. Sophie looked at him, her eyes steady but filled with regret. The one person you never suspected. The one person who's been controlling everything from the start. Victor's mind spun. Adrian Blackwood. The name sent a cold shiver down his spine. Adrian had been a friend, a mentor, someone who had helped him get to the top. They had worked side by side, trusted each other in ways that ran deeper than just business. But now it was clear that Adrian had been playing him too. Victor stared at the printout, the words blurring as his world began to crumble around him. No. It can't be. Sophie's voice broke through his disbelief. It's the only explanation, Victor. Adrian knew you were vulnerable. He used you, manipulated you. And now he's using your empire as his own personal pawn. Victor felt the walls closing in around him. Adrian had always been the one person he had never questioned. The thought that he had been betrayed by someone he considered family was unthinkable. Where is he? Victor demanded, his voice fierce. What's he planning? Sophie took a deep breath. He's already made his move. He's the one behind the cover-ups, the one pulling the strings on the missing money, the shady deals. He's in control, Victor. Victor's fists clenched. He couldn't let Adrian get away with this. Not after everything they had built together. But there was one thing he needed to know before they could move forward. You have to find him, he said, his voice cold with determination. We have to take him down. But as Sophie nodded and turned to leave, Victor's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his blood ran cold. It was a message from an unknown number. We know what you're planning. Stop now or it'll be the last thing you ever do. Victor's hand shook as he held the phone, his mind racing. Adrian had made his move. And now Victor was caught in the middle of a deadly game he never saw coming. The boardroom was plunged into a haunting silence. The blood oozing from Adrian Blackwood's chest spread rapidly across the plush carpet beneath him. His body twitched, his eyes wide in disbelief as he gasped for breath. The seconds felt like hours, each one heavier than the last. Victor's heart pounded in his chest. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on the man who had once been a mentor, a confidant, now laying in a pool of his own blood. Adrian, no. Victor whispered, though he knew it was too late. Sophie's voice pierced the silence. Victor, this is it. This is what it was all leading to. Victor couldn't take his eyes off Adrian, who was now motionless. The weight of everything that had happened crashed down on him, the lies, the betrayal, the manipulation. Adrian had been at the heart of it all, but in the end, it wasn't just the conspiracy that had brought him down. It was his own arrogance, his need to control, his inability to understand that others might have the power to expose him. Suddenly Victor felt the sting of the world he'd been living in. His empire, his success, all of it was hollow. Built on lies, on manipulation, on taking advantage of people like Sophie, like Zara, like the countless others who had been crushed under the weight of his ambition. "I should have never let it get this far," Victor said, his voice shaky. His mind felt like it was spinning out of control, but one thing was clear. Adrian's empire was crumbling, and he was the one who had been given the power to bring it all to light. The room was still, as if everyone were holding their breath. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of their choices. Sophie stepped forward, her eyes meeting Victor's. "You did what you had to do, Victor," she said softly. "You've taken down the man who was at the root of this. But now you need to make sure his empire doesn't survive." Victor nodded, the gravity of the situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. He reached down and picked up the drive from the table, Sophie's evidence. It was more than just a set of files. It was the lifeline that could save everything he had fought for. He couldn't afford to let it slip through his fingers. But just as he reached for his phone, preparing to make the call that would end this once and for all, a knock on the door interrupted him. The door to the boardroom opened and in stepped another figure, someone Victor hadn't expected. The man was tall, with an air of authority that matched his sharp, steely eyes. It was Agent Park, the very agent who had been investigating Victor's empire. "You're too late," Victor said, looking up at Park, his voice firm. He hadn't expected the agent to be the one to bring him down, but now he was here to finish the job. Park's gaze shifted to Adrian's lifeless body on the floor. "No one said you had to take matters into your own hands." Victor clenched his fists. "This mess was always bigger than me," he said. "But now it's over. And I intend to see it through." Agent Park looked at the drive in Victor's hand, then to Sophie. "I assume that's what we need to expose everything?" Sophie nodded. "It's all there. Everything Adrian thought he could hide." Park stepped forward, eyeing the evidence with a serious expression. "Then let's make sure it all ends here. You've done your part, Victor. Now it's time to finish it." Victor nodded, feeling a strange sense of finality wash over him. For years he had been part of a system that had thrived on corruption. But now, with Adrian dead and the truth exposed, it was time for him to step away from the wreckage. "This is just the beginning," Sophie said, her voice steady as she looked at Victor. "We still have to take down everything Adrian built. The board, the people he's corrupted." Victor's gaze softened as he looked at her. "I know. But this is my fight now. I'll take responsibility for what I've done and see this through." Sophie placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression full of understanding. "Then let's make sure this is the end of the Blackwood Empire. Once and for all." Victor looked around the boardroom. The cold, sterile environment that had once been his kingdom now felt like a prison. There were no cheers, no applause. Only silence. He turned toward the doors, heading toward the elevator with Sophie at his side. As they passed through the halls of the building, every step Victor took felt like a step toward something new. The life he had known, the empire he had spent years building, had crumbled. But in its place there was a chance for something real. Something honest. And just as the elevator doors closed, Victor turned to Sophie, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Let's make sure no one ever forgets what happened here." Sophie smiled, her eyes meeting his. "They won't." The elevator doors slid shut, and the story of the Blackwood Empire, of betrayal, corruption and redemption, came to a close.